On this episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show, we talk about rate of force development in the rehabilitation process.
The Ask Mike Reinold Show. Helping people feel better, move better, and perform better.
Before we get to the podcast, I wanted to make sure you knew about my free online course on the Introduction to Performance Therapy and Training. If you want to learn how to get started optimizing and enhancing performance, this is the course for you. Head to mikereinold.com/performance to sign up today.
Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show. We are here in Boston, Champion PT Performance, answering your questions. Anything you want to talk about, head to mikereinold.com, click on that podcast link, and you can fill out the form to ask us more questions. Let's see. Today, we have Dan Pope, Dave Tilley, Kevin Coughlin, Lenny Macrina here for you answering your questions. Len, who do we have for students today?
We have some amazing students that it's just amazing to have them in our facility. They've really contributed well. We have the two-headed monster from Northeastern University Huskies, Noah Sprinkle, one sprinkle. It's a single sprinkle, and Libby McCann. Libby is a world-class rower, row your boat. Jackson Boggs from the University of Kentucky Wildcats, and we have Devin Limerick from NYU, wide receiver college football extraordinaire. Good hands.
That's pretty good.
Bam.
I feel like we need to test it. We haven't tested you out yet.
I know.
I want to see those hands in action.
I want to see hands.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I think you'll be able to handle a pass from me, but
throw stuff at him all day.
I like that. All right, real question for you though, D. Are you guys really that good at catching, or is it just those sticky gloves? That's my question with wide receivers. All right, anyway, what do we have for a question today?
For today, we got one from Christian from San Diego. It says, rate of force development has become popular in the strength and conditioning world. How do you incorporate this into the rehab setting? And have you guys started to work on this with your athletes returning from injury at Champion?
Awesome. Good one, Boggs, third base Boggs. Yeah, I mean, rate of force development, right? I would say at Champion with our athletes, we've been using force plates now for several years. We've been using even like velocity-based training stuff. You know, what we did in the strength and conditioning world, I would say, is we realized that it's not just about how strong you are. It's not just about how powerful you are, but it's about how you can use that together, right? And a lot of times what that comes to is like, okay, how fast can we produce that force so that way we can use it in athletic environment, right? D's trying to get open, right? It's how fast can he explode right off the line and try to get a nice deep pass, right? See how I brought that back into our previous conversation? That was good. But you know what I mean? It's like, it's sometimes I think in rehab, right? Over the years, we said like, okay, we're not good at loading. Okay, we're probably better at loading now. Okay, now we're not good at return to floor progression. Okay, we're probably better at that. I think this might be that last thing. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's always going to be something else we suck at, right? But this is that next thing, right? That I think we haven't focused enough on is rate of force development. So, who wants to start this one off? Dan, you wanna talk a little bit about RFD?
Yeah, for sure. What I will say is that, we kind of like if we had Jonah or Dewey on here, they could talk about how they do it more specifically. But from rehab context, I think it is really important. And that was one of those topics at the Sports Academy annual meeting, talking about how rate of force development kind of lags behind other traditional strength indicators. So let's say post-op ACL, check the quad strength, looks pretty good. The rate of force development might not be there, right? And the other piece, I think you can test this just like you would test anything else. Obviously, it depends on like the dynamometer that you have. We use the ones from Vald, and they can actually check the rate of force development. The thing that we have trouble with, and I've tried several times, is that in the setup, if you have someone sitting, pressing against a handheld dynamometer, and trying to kick directly into that, sometimes I think the data might be off, right? Just because of the way you have to kick into this thing aggressively. Some folks are kind of protecting how fast they're kicking. It's a little odd, it's a strange setup, although I've tried it a few times, right? It's not perfect. I actually had this discussion a little bit with Jill Monson's group, which they talked about rate of force development and how they tend to measure it, and they use more jumping as an indicator. And that makes sense, right? Rate of force development is very important when you jump. The only thing I will say is that if you're using things like force plates, which we use at Champion, which I obviously do recommend that you do use if you have access to it, I think folks are still able to compensate a little bit. So I think if you're going to do any sort of serial testing, if you're going to be testing quad strength, if you're going to be looking at jumping, it's probably worthwhile to incorporate rate of force development into your testing as well. Maybe we put this a little bit later into the athlete's rehab, because producing force really quickly is obviously a little bit more, strain or stress on that area. And then basically you can utilize exercise based on whether or not they have those deficits, right? So if I have an athlete that still has a strength deficit, I want to try to make sure that I work on that. But if the rate of force development is good, maybe I don't have to do as much power exercise for that area, right? And you had chatted a little bit about this prior to the podcast. When I think about rate of force development, it's just trying to be more powerful. And I think generally speaking, we can cue that with our athletes. We can program that. So are you asking your athletes to move quickly under load? Are you having them go at an average or normal pace? What are the cues that you use for the athlete? And then based on your testing, you can use more or less of those exercises and those cues, so on and so forth. So
Yeah. And to your point, Dan, even on force plates, right, you can jump slowly, right, and powerfully, right? And that's an interesting thing to do. Is like, if you're not specifically teaching somebody how to do that back in the rehab process, sometimes I don't understand that they have to produce force quickly, right? And I would say, even just now with my experience, working with younger athletes, even in a baseball population with throwing, and now even just like as a coach in youth sports with my children, right? You can see some kids that are really good at rate of force development and some kids that aren't, right? And you see those kids that just swing slowly, right? Or they run slowly. I know, that feels weird. And then you have the other kid that gets up there and wants to destroy the ball, right? And I don't know if that's teaching them intent or if it's like rate of force development, but we talk about that in the gym all the time with our youth athletes. One of the first things we teach them is intent, right? That you have to get in there and you have to try to, like, I'm going to take this med ball and not just throw it against the wall. I want to smash it into the wall, right? And you do that sort of thing. And I just think it's a skill. It's a different thing that we aren't always working on. Right. So, interesting. I have a question for the group. I think, Lenny, you might know this. I think everyone might know this to a little bit. With our handheld dynamometers, most of the ones we've used in the past do measure rate of force development. Even some of the cheaper models like the Tindex and stuff do. It was my understanding that perhaps it's the sampling rate. I don't want to say this incorrectly, but is that data might not be completely accurate with a handheld dynamometer. Does anybody have any info on that they want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was traditionally correct. I think we use the Bald Dynamo. I think they have. I think their sampling rate, from what I understand, is more than appropriate to get accurate data for rate of force development. I use it a little, and I use it when I'm testing quad strength, and then also when we use the force deck when we're doing like jump testing, like drop jump testing, or kind of movement jump testing as well. We'll try to look at that and analyze it. So again, it's a curve, right? It's a curve of how fast they can produce a maximal force. So if you think of it, again, people don't watch our videos. You picture a steep increase in the speed at which they're producing a force, comparing it to the other side, and you're looking at basically old school curves, like old school slopes that we used to learn in like geometry class or trigonometry class, whatever class that was, and you're looking to see which curve is steeper, more or less, as a simplified version. You want a very steep curve. You want them to be able to produce a force really fast over a short period of time. And in my world, the ACL world, they just can't do that. It looks like they can, but when you isolate the quad or you have them do some kind of a specific movement, they still struggle months and months and months after what you think they are ready to do. And so that's kind of that be all end all check. Can they produce a huge force quickly? And usually no. And like you said, we have to be training that. I use GymAware, which is just a software that helps to give a visual feedback on producing a force quickly in a certain amount of time, and giving just a quick feedback on, are they doing a squat quickly? Are they doing a trap bar deadlift quick enough for the amount of power I'm trying to produce? And that's just a little visual cue for them to be able to move quickly. So we use GymAware in our facility. Yeah.
I like that, Len. I mean, that's a good point, right? Sometimes it's coaching, right? It's teaching them, hey,
Yeah,
don't just jump. I want you to jump. I want you to jump as fast as you can, like that sort of thing, right?
right.
Sometimes it's that, but I like the visual component feedback, right? That you can do on both the force plates and the VBT, the velocity-based training stuff with our gym wear. To see that, I actually think is helpful. And to see the curve and say, hey, make this curve steeper next time, and let them kind of like reconcile that as they go through. Like, oh, okay, if I try this, it works better. I think that's a
Right,
great way
right.
of development. Dan.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple thoughts now after hearing all this stuff. I do think one of the things that, some of the velocity-based training I think is helpful for is that typically you kind of stop your sets once your speed drops off. So quality is really important. So I think getting technology involved is really neat. Back in the day, I have a powerlifting background, and guys named Louis Simmons, rest in peace, was very popular for talking about dynamic effort work, where the intent of the sets is speed. It's just basically power work with the heavier load. And what's kind of nice about some of this technology is it'll tell you when you're falling off the wagon a little bit. So maybe in your set and rep prescription, you're trying to keep people away from failure, excuse me, maybe having kind of shorter sets and getting a little feedback about how fast you're doing those sets. You can kind of rest adequately so that you can move quickly and then stop exercising once you get to the point where you're no longer kind of working that quality. So I think that is helpful. And then going back to what Lenny had said too, this is totally an anecdote, but whenever I try to measure rate of force development, my numbers are so all over the place that I'm just like, is this
Right,
data helping me at all? Right.
right,
So that
right.
was my gripe with that. And I think a lot of it is like maybe I'm not because I think 10 deck, whatever, has a setting where it only picks up between 20 and 80% of how hard you're pushing. And that would actually be pretty nice. If there's a better way we can kind of set up the vol that would make it more consistent, maybe that would help. But I think in general, just the setup makes it challenging. So the data is all over the place. And maybe that's just how rate of force development is from day to day. But that's been my experience with it.
Yeah, I think even the Tindeck has some limitations too with that. I think it's hard to do, right? I mean, it's such a quick period of time. Everybody says you don't need isokinetics anymore, right? But maybe you do, for some of that. But trust me, we're not going to buy one, but you get it. Dave, what up? From your perspective, Dave, I mean, obviously you have a lot of explosive athletes and stuff. Like, what are some things you do to kind of work on this with your athletes?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two layers. One is the more traditional sense of most people think about this like with lower extremity type injuries. And so when you think about the rehab process, right, we're trying to go from the basics of like range of motion and stuff, then basic strength, then we layer on power. And if you look at most field and sport athletes in particular, a lot of the ability for them to be really highly competitive is like very explosive, quick, bursted reaction movements. And so soccer, field hockey, lacrosse, you're versus somebody else and you have to make a quick step on somebody and get ahead of them or kind of get outside of them. And that is very explosive rate of force development. So I think when you're programming for, lower extremity type stuff, a lot of your drills have to be aimed at, if they're in the end stage of rehab, is either that reactionary explosiveness or also just drills that set up that first impulse of movement, right? So you think about somebody doing like a banded sprint start where they're not sprinting, 10 yards, but they're just doing literally the first three steps off the line, so to speak, or kind of when they're lining up with someone to go, or also a lot of the other planes of rotational or kind of cutting and pivoting. You want to really make sure somebody is comfortable getting in and out of that kind of like deep amortization phase and explosively jumping the other way. Because again, think about field sports where they're trying to get around somebody dribbling or whatever. And so when you program, you want to think about that, like Dan alluded to, is maybe it's 4 sets with a 2-minute rest in between where you're doing something in between, but you're really letting someone's PCR system fully recover to train maximal effort. And I have a girl, super high level field hockey player right now, who's coming back from a hamstring strain, and her end stage rehab, it's a 45-minute session. The majority of her session is resting and waiting to recover between super explosive bouts. So banded sprint starts or step up skip jumps and stuff like that. So I think you want to program for that. But the other area, I think, I spend a lot of time working in like lumbar spine rehab areas for a lot of rotational athletes, baseball, softball, and then obviously gymnastics, is those sports, baseball and things like that, are explosive bodyweight sports, and the amount of force and torque going through someone's spine in the end stage of throwing or hitting in particular, or gymnastics, is really important to train that type of stress on their spine. So whether someone's doing throwing and it's rotational, or hitting, that's where people get fractures, right? Guys fracture their back when they swing really hard explosively. So med balls are a really great way to progressively load somebody into that movement, whereas you would do 3 reps of, to your point, Mike, like I want the ball to explode. You throw so hard. Like I want you to slam this ball as hard as you possibly can. Or we say like, throw to the ceiling and like hit the ceiling. So trying to give somebody, 3 reps of literally maximal effort med ball throws is, in my opinion, more viable at the end stage of rehab than giving somebody, 15 to 20 sets of box jumps or whatever.
Right. I like that. And I think
Great.
I'll end with one other note of something kind of I've been thinking about as we're going through this episode here is that, like neurocognitive training right now is popular, right? We're learning a lot about it. We're starting to integrate it more and more because we do know it was one of those things that we probably missed out on, right? But, keep in mind with neurocognitive training, like sometimes that leads to a delay, right? Like, yeah, you have to process a lot of stimulation and then make a reaction to it. Just realize that that's just one end of a spectrum of things that we need to work on, right? And you're certainly not working on rate of force development if you're focused on neurocognitive training, right? At least initially, right? Now, maybe the end game of all this is that you can do all this and produce force rapidly with a neurocognitive stimulus, but jeepers, that's hard at the beginning for people, right? So keep that in mind. Like if you're just doing all neurocognitive training because that's what seems cool on Instagram, you're probably missing out on some key things, right? So just like everything else, we have to work on all, abilities, all levels of athleticism, all, ways that we integrate information to produce, strength and power. So, kind of keep that in mind with rate of force development. I don't want you to miss out on that either. Okay. Awesome. Great episode. Thanks again. If you have a question like that, head to mikereinold.com, click on that podcast link and fill out the form to ask away. And please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever you listen to. And we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.